So welcome to the State Library, and it's exciting because this is the kick-off of our Masters project. So, and continues our wonderful year of architecture. But of course I begin by the fact that the State Library acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which this library stands. We pay our respect to Aboriginal elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other First Nations people amongst us tonight. We celebrate in particular the diversity of First Nations cultures and languages across Australia. And I always like to do a huge thank you to, in particular, to our Indigenous engagement team that works right across the state doing fantastic work day in, day out. So 2025 is our year of architecture, and it's a celebration of the incredible architectural collections of the library, and of course the role of architects and architecture in shaping our lives. Tonight is the first edition of our 5-part In Conversation series, featuring some of Australia's most accomplished and influential architects, and it's hosted by the wonderful Tim Horton. There are many distinguished people here tonight, and I can see many of you in the crowd from the architectural community, but I do want to do a shout out to the architect of this very space, Andrew Anderson's AO, who's here tonight and is also working with us on leading the refurbishment project of the Marie Bashir Library. I also want to note that we've got several people here from our Library Foundation, John Pearson, Rowan Dark and Christine Howard. And there are many donors that support us in the very great work that we do in this architecture space. We also have many people from the creative and the architectural industries, and a welcome to the newly minted Executive Director of Create New South Wales, Kerry Glasscock in particular. It's really fitting that we begin this series with Richard Johnson, AO, whose work has left an extraordinary legacy across some of Australia's most important public and cultural buildings. And we see that as we walk through the cities, and I often think of your work, Richard, in large part because I was lucky enough to work at the Museum of Sydney for very many years, and we met so many times to talk about that great building, and I was grateful for everything that you helped me understand about architecture. And a big shout out, I know that Dr. Peter Emmett and Dr. Peter Watts are in the auditorium tonight, and of course were absolutely built that project and worked with you on that project. So welcome to them too. I think Richard's projects demonstrate how architecture can be elegant, civic-minded, and of course enduring, and how design can give back to the city. Tonight we look forward to hearing his reflections on a career shaping public space, purpose, and memory. We really want to thank our partners for the Year of Architecture, the New South Wales Architects Registration Board, whose support has helped make the Masters project possible. Thank you to Dr. Kirsten Orr, Melissa Hollis and the whole team at ARB for all your work with us this year. It's been fantastic working with you. This year's collaboration between the library and ARB celebrates architectural excellence and invites public audiences, provides them with opportunities to discover more about the country's finest architects and their work. Thank you for joining us tonight, despite the weather and that I know that we were a bit nervous. That some people, we know Sydney-siders often pike when the weather doesn't look good. They're not hardy like Adelaide, where I'm from. Thank you for joining us. I'd now really like to welcome Glenn Scott, President of the New South Wales Architects Registration Board, to say a few words. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you for those kind words, Caroline, and welcome everyone this evening. Very glad to see you all there, and yes, thank you for making the effort. My name's Glenn Scott. I'm the President of the New South Wales Architects Registration Board. And on behalf of the New South Wales Architects Registration Board, I want to say how proud we are to support the State Library of New South Wales in this year of architecture. This is an important initiative and one that opens up architecture to a broader conversation about public life, our cities, and the spaces we all share. Tonight marks the beginning of the Masters Project, a 5-part series that brings leading Australian architects into public conversation. It's about their craft. Thank you. That's me. I don't get a doctor or any. I'm around and surrounded by very, very eminent people that I have long admired, and I'm really looking forward to Richard's talk with Tim tonight. But tonight, public conversations, yes, we're talking about the craft and these individuals' crafts of architecture, but also the challenges we all face and the shared responsibilities we hold as design custodians of our natural and built environments, cities, communities, and culture. The conversations will be led by Tim Horton, an award-winning architect, former registrar of the New South Wales ARB, and current Commissioner for the Land Environment Court of New South Wales. Tim always manages to bring a thoughtful, practical voice to the big questions facing the built environment, and these sessions are for everyone, not just the architects. So please also ask questions. At the New South Wales Architects Registration Board, our purpose is to build trust in the profession and build value in the contributions architects make. And that means supporting public engagements like this. We want to see more people thinking critically, creatively about the impact of architecture on society. Programs like this help foster a deeper appreciation for all the spaces we inhabit and for the architects who shape them with care, ethics and long-term thinking as custodians of these environments for our future generations, not just today. The choices we make today about our natural and built environments echo down generations. We need to think about what is the long-term legacy of the choices we make today before we act. In terms of architectural legacy, we have a truly outstanding lineup ahead. Louise Cox, Peter Stutchbury, Richard Lepastre and Penelope Slidler. But of course, we are thrilled to start tonight with Richard Johnson, AO. Richard's contribution to Australian public architecture is profound. And to mention only a few, the Australian War Memorial and the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, the Asian Wing at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and his long collaboration with Jorn and Jan Utzon on a series of Opera House projects that are still ongoing today. These are significant civic projects of the highest calibre, delivered with the utmost level of care and thoughtfulness, something that all of us as architects can aspire to. This civic and public sensibility continues into Richard's commercial projects, giving back to the cities by incorporating generous semi-public spaces, colonnades, and creating new connections within our cities. His work was recognised with an MBE in 1977 and the Australian Institute Architects Gold Medal in 2008. So please also join us for the upcoming series of great talks, and each session will bring a new voice and a new perspective on these important topics. Tickets are on sale at the library's website, so please check it out. So let's begin, and please join me in welcoming Tim Horton and Richard Johnson.
Thank you very much. I'm going to echo the sentiments and say thank you, Sydney, for coming out. You all look wonderful. Richard and I hope you'll forgive me, sir, we're both a bit nervous. It's the beginning of the series, as you've heard, and this is not scripted. Richard has a rough idea of the questions, and I've got a rough idea on what his responses might be. At the heart of this series is a question: what does it really take to master architecture? And it's a question that the Merckett Foundation, that I'm involved with, has been asking for around 20 years in running masterclasses for students and for architects from around the world. But we turn that around this time in this series by asking the masters themselves. What you're going to hear is an abbreviated version of a longer form podcast that Richard kindly agreed to endure about 8 weeks ago. And so we will use that as our departure point for tonight. And that series is supported both by Merckett Foundation and also the Alistair Swain Foundation that's made that possible through its grant series encourage you all to look into that. Thank you to the State Library for hosting this. Thank you to Andrew for a wonderful room in which to do it, and to the Architects Registration Board for your support. I will not introduce Richard with another bio, because what we're about to experience is in some ways a spoken biography of Richard, from what we might describe as the origin story that leads to the thinking that is behind some of the projects that have been already mentioned. Richard, in advance of tonight, has provided a series of images which we're going to rely on as we move through. But here's the thing, because it's not scripted, the images may roughly align to what we're talking about, but also may not.
I doubt that very much.
So Callum in the booth up there knows that if we suddenly go forwards and back, we're not, we haven't lost it. We're just trying to find the best image that goes with Richard's wonderful words. And we want to start at the very beginning, because we're interested in what shapes these architects. And Richard Johnson has spoken of a sense of calm that comes from knowing a place deeply. And I want to ask Richard to start with, what was your place growing up when you were young? Where did you come from and what shaped you?
Well, we had the great fortune, I think, of a few years of my very early... Is that working? Yeah. Early in my life, we moved from the inner city to the bush, to the upper reaches of the Lane Cove Valley. And my parents built a humble house and brought up 6 children there. And my special place was the bush. So most of my youth, I guess, was exploring the gullies and the ravines and the cliff faces and the waterfalls of that upper reaches of the valley. And it was very, very critical in giving me space to think. And I think I enjoyed the stimulation of the energy and the excitement of the city, and the calm, tranquility and beauty and space to think, and also, I guess, the space to retreat to of the bush. And even to this day, we still enjoy that privilege of having a city pad and our house in the bush.
You're a noted gardener as well, which is one you'll have to listen to the podcast for. So Richard and I have agreed there's a few times we're going to mention things but move on. And Richard's story of gardening is fantastic, the front yard and the backyard and the dichotomy between the two. And so you describe your schooling as, if I can use the term, somewhat middling and uneventful. Is that a fair comment?
Unmotivated. In fact, the vocational guidance tutor on exiting the school told me that there was absolutely no way I could be an architect, and advised me with great insight that perhaps I would be interested in optometry because I had a pair of glasses on. In fact, I really had no motivation at school. I was good at physics, actually, because I could see some practical application but my problem was that I was not interested in any of the subjects they forced me to take. Because I had a certain level of intellect, I had to take 2 languages, 2 sciences and 2 maths. And I was interested in geography and social history and ancient history and modern history and art, but I couldn't take those. So really my intellectual life didn't start till I went to UNSW.
UNSW. And so you've said your intellectual life started when you stepped on to the campus. And we've already just heard a glimpse of what interests you in education, which is a broad education. But University of New South Wales was not only, was broad because it encompassed literature, but also bricklaying.
Absolutely.
Welding.
Well, it was only instigated as a university. It had been a technical college, only a few years before I went there. And as you can see from that image, it was mostly sand dunes and a few buildings down near Anzac Parade. But fortunately, it was still imbued with the Beaux-Arts tradition of teaching architecture, where the humanities, all of the arts, music, science, literature, were core subjects for an architect. We did 5 years of art theory and art practice, 5 years, half a day every week. And it was seminal in terms of understanding the role art plays in defining culture and what you can get from art as an architect that inspires your work. We did 6 weeks courses of all of the trades, bricklaying, carpentry, welding, and I was hopeless at all of them. But the important thing that it taught me was a connection and an understanding or an attempt to try and understand the material, and also a joy of watching something being built. And I was fortunate to have a very close uncle who was a builder. And from a very young age, he took me to his building sites. And I was fascinated watching a building emerging. And still to this day, almost seeing the building built and what you can still achieve and fine-tune during construction gives me great energy. And it's an essential part of architecture.
And this duality of being both engaged in the intellectual and the theoretical, deeply engaged, but also the interest in making and how things are made and of what they are made, is something I think that is quite enduring in your career. Perhaps it starts here, but I think we're going to hear a bit of that, the importance of making,
Yeah.
And how things go together.
Yeah, I think Utzon had a wonderful saying that at the point of conception of a project must be everything necessary for its execution or for its making. And so often you see a student or even a practitioner producing a design and they don't know what material it's going to be made from. I mean, that you can't do that. I mean, if it's a brick building, it has a certain character. If it's a stone building, it has a certain character. It's intrinsic to the concept. So that sort of integration, that total integration of a concept with its materials and place and time and technology is really critical, I think, to produce enduring work.
And I think this surely must come from some of the tutors that you experienced while you're at
No question, no question.
University of New South Wales. And perhaps first we start here, I think.
With Peter Collar. I mean, Collar was the, I guess, design theory, in charge of design theory. And he brought into our studio, into the design studio, some of the best practitioners in Sydney at the time. So we had this, he himself was a significant architect. I remember going to the first few lectures of Peter Collar, and most of it I had no idea what he was talking about. It was way above my head, but I thought this must be important, I better take a lot of notes. And then I realised that there's a lot of notes, there's a lot of things he's saying that I have no idea. Is this guy a fraud or is he worth persevering with? So I went and looked at some of his buildings and I suddenly took more notes. And he was one of the few lecturers that I went to that years after I left uni, I kept discovering things that he'd told me that I only half understood. So he had a seminal lecture called 7,000 Facets of Siena. And in those days, there were sort of towers of Kodak carousel slides. And he'd take us one by one, step by step, through Siena and talk about the history and development of the form of the city and duality and symbolism and multiplicity and rhythm and proportion and materiality, all of these wonderful concepts. And I only half understood all of that at the time. And then we had the great fortune of, in our combi van with the 2 kids in the back and Maureen driving, arriving at the gates of Siena. And in those days, you could drive through the city. There was no pedestrianisation of the city in those days. And the red light was there, and a moment flashed through my mind, and I thought, collar. And I jumped out of the car and slammed the door and screamed to Maureen, "I'll see you at the cathedral." And I had no idea if I could find my way up to the cathedral. But of course, I got there before she did.
We should explain, why was the lecture called 7,000 Facets of Siena?
Well, I think he had 7,000 slides, but I'm not sure.
And so, also as part of the suite of tutors that you experienced at University of New South Wales, are these 4? Do you want to explain how these are?
In those days, there was a program of funding eminent internationals to come to NSW, and they mainly spoke to the graduating year, but of course they gave seminal lectures to the whole years. And in my time there, the first lecturer to come was Buckminster Fuller, and it was absolutely astonishing. He gave a talk in the Science Auditorium, and I think it's about 2,000 people, and he spoke for 2.5 hours, non-stop. And nobody moved. Nobody left the auditorium. So the concepts were so breathtakingly fresh and innovative and dynamic. He challenged the auditorium to, the first question he said is, how much does the Queen Mary weigh? And there were surprisingly quite a few correct answers shouted out from the students, 81,000 tonnes. The next question was, what does the Empire State Building weigh? Not a single guess. And then he posed the question, well, we should know. We should know what our buildings weigh. We should know how much resources we're using. We should know whether we could use less and create more. And so he introduced this sort of concept of, really responsible use of materials, a new idea of sustainability. Stern Elias Rasmussen came in the next year, and he was Utsen's teacher. And he introduced us to this, I guess, Scandinavian humanism, and also a sort of love of crafting and materiality of buildings. But he famously carried around with him one of those wonderful Swedish folding metre rules. And any time a student asked him a question, he'd roll out the rule and ask them to show, how big is that? What are you talking about, And so he was always measuring things, and that was an important lesson. Yoshinobu Ashihara, one of Japan's early modernists, was really, and I had a great opportunity later in life to work closely in collaboration with him, and he introduced me to the sort of really interesting way that Japanese perceive space. And finally, the great Christopher Tunnard, landscape architect and planner, really introduced me to the importance of city planning and the integration of landscape.
So if we go back to this slide, we've heard of the great tutors you've had, but at the same time, it's remarkable for me to hear you say, I've never really trusted my own intuition. And so it was important to find a framework.
Yeah, I still don't. I think I like to feel that I'm tapping into knowledge that others have in history have solved before me, and maybe I'm reinventing it or reappropriating it for another age and another time. So I was constantly looking, even beginning as a student, with some guiding principles that might help me in the work. And of course, The first was the modular, corpse modular. And from that, and then I became fascinated with Corb's early work, which is very classical. And so one could see the transition from his understanding of the classics and classic proportion into a much more contemporary expression, but using and reinventing classical proportion in his own way to inspire and generate his own work. And then from there, I discovered Vitruvius, and from Vitruvius, the sort of golden sections and proportions. And these have actually guided the whole of my work for the whole of my career. And I think after Vitruvius, I discovered Doxiadis's theory of the perception of space in ancient Greek sites, which starts from the point of entry to the site. And I was fascinated with an understanding, because I was interested in proportion and scale, as to why on earth was the site so ad hoc in terms of its planning when the buildings were so geometrically precise. Until I discovered Doxiadis and until I went to the site. And once you're there, and you at the point of entry, there's a 10 and a 12 part theory that Doxiadis developed. And this is, if you divide your cone of vision into 30 degrees or 36 degrees, and those arcs radiate out from your eye level, and then you radius from those with Fibonacci series, you'll intersect every single point that lays out all the buildings on the historic sites. But the singular vista to the east is open. So it embraces the landscape and embraces the city. These I think, this sense that an ordering device can be something that feels so natural you don't know it's there. But once you experience it, you know that there's something sublime happening, that you've got to work out what it is and how you can use it.
So talking about the sublime, at university something else is going on.
Well, we were so fortunate. I think that the building was, Opera House was being built during our time as students. And a number of us had found a way onto the site at night through the security fence, and we knew when the guards, what the guards' routine was, so we could bypass the guards. We never got caught, actually, surprisingly. But it was absolutely magic being in there in the moonlight with the shells just emerging, this sort of magical space, magical ruin. And seeing the precast formwork and looking at the way the building was being built. And of course, we were distraught. We felt totally and utterly robbed of that opportunity to see the completion under Utzon's vision of the whole building.
And so we then zoom forward to an audacious moment on graduation.
Absolutely.
What do you decide to do?
Well, in the first year out, a mate and I, Peter Page and I, entered an international competition for the House of Parliament extensions in London. How on earth we ever thought that was a useful... And we were convinced we were going to win it. I was 23 years old, and we got this telegram. In those days, you get telegrams, of course. You get a telegram and it said, present yourself to the Sergeant-at-Arms, stop, by a certain date, you see, for briefing to the second stage. So we got into the second stage. There were hundreds of international entries. And we were astonished, and we'd spent a lot of time in crafting our entry so that we looked like a big firm. We'd spent a lot of money, you see, and then it suddenly dawned on me that a 23-year-old recent graduate is not going to look like he's from a big firm. So I grew a beard. And of course, in those days, I couldn't grow any, I didn't have enough time to grow much on the side, so I kept it as a goatee beard. And I hadn't realised at the time that as I aged and lost a bit of hair, I started to look like Lenin. And this became even more apparent when I started to travel to China, because I was right at the age when Lenin was roughly bald like I was. And Edmund Capon and I were in Xi'an looking at the Intune Warriors, because I was doing an exhibition at the art gallery. And he had decided that we'd go up to Temple Mount to have a look over the site, to get an overview of the site, and there was a sort of gigantic staircase. He's much fitter than I was, so he was charging ahead and I was struggling behind. And there were two Chinese guards at the top of the staircase, and they stopped Edmund and pushed him to one side and kept smiling at me, encouraging me to come up, you see. And I came up, and then they, with quite a bit of ceremony, they escorted me, kept Edmund to the side, and escorted me onto the site. And then they talked to Edmund, and then they kept smiling at me, and I thought, that's very strange. I said to Edmund, what on earth did they say? What's going on here? He said, they said that very seminal Chinese revolutionary phrase, let Lenin go first.
So I'll come back to China shortly. You don't win.
No, we don't. We got fourth.
Got fourth.
And we'd already worked out how we were going to set up the office in London. I mean, this is what's marvellous about students, you know, the unconstrained and unrivalled optimism of youth. It's just so infectious and wonderful, and it's a pity we lose it.
But you go from strength to strength. You return from here to federal government employment.
Yes.
And you are given an extraordinary opportunity with expo buildings. As
Yes.
someone who is well known and esteemed for exhibition design, this is quite an important moment, and there are two expo buildings that you work on in your own right, 75 and 85, if I'm right. Tell us about what's important, or what did expo buildings teach you?
Well, Paul, that helped me on 85, he's in the audience, so he'll correct what I'm saying. But the thing about expo buildings, I think, was that you had a message to project. And the architect in those days was responsible for everything. The building, the exhibits, the uniforms, the VIP, artwork, everything. Extraordinary opportunity. So, and we had an advisory panel of eminent experts that advised us on what might make a good exhibition. So there was this, but at the end you knew that you had limited time to impress a foreign visitor with what the overall message was. We had a criteria, I think, that if somebody ran through the pavilion at speed, because they were generally, because of the crowd numbers, they were generally a linear circuit, that if they ran through and at the exit were asked what pavilion you were in and what's the message you take away, that they would know that they were in the Australian pavilion and that there was, and what it was about. But that was a huge responsibility, and it gave me a great interest in, I guess, exhibition design.
And are you then back with Ashihara at this point? We've met Ashihara
Absolutely.
before, and you're working with Ashihara. Yep.
And Ashihara introduced me to Issei and to Katsura Rikyu, both of which were difficult at the time to get into. Katsura was very restricted. It's more open and easier to get into now. And I was taken through by a guide that Ashihara had organised, and he was explaining to me that that Japanese are getting taller now, so that they're clipping the hedges a little bit taller so that you can't see the water. The interesting thing about Katsura-Rikyu is it's this totally controlled and orchestrated experience for the visitor from the gate to the moon viewing. And this journey through the landscape was so beautifully controlled. You could come over a hollow wooden mound in the gravel and know that you were on a bridge by the sound of it. And you could hear the water going under the bridge, but you couldn't see anything because the hedges were too tall. And then you came up to this man-made or rocky mountain, which was quite treacherous, and you constantly, and you could see the water below you. You're constantly worrying about falling down, and when you get down to the bottom, there's this giant rock that's safety, so you're heading down for that. When you get there, you look up, and of course that's your first glimpse of the palace. But the interesting thing is that the palace has been in full sight from the top of the hill, but you haven't seen it. And when I first experienced this, I thought, this is absolute, am I imagining this, or is this... So when Maureen and I went there together, I let her go ahead to see, I didn't tell her about this experience, just to see what she would do. She did exactly the same thing. So, and then I realised that if a landscape architect can do this with something that's growing and preserve and maintain that experience with a living group of things, then how much easier it must be for an architect who's dealing with static things to work also and control a journey through a building or through a city.
So maybe at this point I might ask then, that's an experience you had in Japan. You are in China in 1977, and this might get us into going to the Bartlett. But in a similar vein, what did you experience going to the Forbidden City? Again, about serial and sequence progression.
The interesting thing about China, just to digress a bit, but China in those days was absolutely amazing because everybody was in Mao suits. Though all in summer it was blue, and in winter it was that olive green, khaki green colour. And then we were, because I was involved in the embassy building, we were going there quite frequently, and between one visit and another, in about 3 months period, they changed the rules so that the citizens could wear colourful clothing. And from one visit where everybody's wearing exactly the same thing to the next visit where they're all wearing Hawaiian T-shirts. You know, it was just sort of quite... But that's a digression. I think the thing that's really intrigued me in China is that I realised that China's planning, they're very organised in terms of city planning and in terms of their thinking. But the axial planning is not two-dimensional. It's not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. The axial planning through the Imperial Palace, you slowly rise. And when you get to the pinnacle, where the throne is, that's probably the smallest temple in the compound, but that's closer to the heavens. So this sense of an axis being three-dimensional was, in an urban design sense, was very interesting. But what was also interesting, I think, is a city that's made up of similar components. It starts with the humble house and the courtyard, and there's a courtyard that's the greeting courtyard, and then there's the house, and then there's a courtyard at the back, which is the private courtyard. And when you take that typology, that's the palace, that's the city, and that's the country. The country has a wall. So this sort of sense that you have an organising device that controls and unifies everything was very interesting.
So let's go back to London, and you enrol in the Bartlett, in a very small and select program, MPhil, in town planning. And that gives you a chance to travel.
Absolutely. Partly why we picked the Bartlett. But the Bartlett was fantastic because that's the beginning of planning. That's where Abercrombie and Holford and Holden started the course. So it was I thought I was going to fail. There was just so many brilliant people there was 25 of us in this MPhil course. There were only three foreigners actually. There was a Greek architect and myself, and a Scot. He joined us. He didn't want to be part of the others. But they were, in those days, planning was opening to a lot of disciplines. So there were political scientists and geographers and very, very smart people. So it was an intellectual challenge to try and keep up with them. But I had the added difficulty, I think, but the benefit of listening to what they were saying about planning in London and trying to see how that applies to Sydney or to Australia or to our culture or our differences. So I had to work harder, but I got more out of it, I think.
And so we're back to Utzon.
Yes.
You see some of Utzon's work. What do you think of
Friedensburg and Kingo houses, absolutely masterful, absolutely breathtaking. Again, like that Scandinavian tradition of controlling everything, from the landscape to the buildings, to the interiors, to the doorknobs, to the furniture. What's interesting about Friedensburg housing is that virtually this is a system of courtyards where the space is loosely defined and people can actually adapt and change it as their life changes or as their needs change. And when you look at Utzon's drawings of these, it's absolutely marvellous how he humanises a detailed drawing, a construction drawing, with people building boats in the carport and kids playing sword fights in the garden, and so you get this real sense, like all of his drawings, they're populated by people doing things, enjoying themselves, and that's his mind process.
So then he and you share something. So we've heard you've crawled under the security gates to see Utzon in progress. You've seen Utzon's work in Europe, and much later you are working with Utzon on work to the Opera House, developing design principles, and then later the Western Loggia and the Utzon Room. And for a man who didn't trust his own intuition, it turns out Utzon needed to be reassured as well from time to time. Would you explain the story of you and Utzon needing to be sure and the role perhaps of self-doubt?
Well, I think so often we'd be in discussions and he'd stop and he'd say, how big is that? I couldn't possibly decide. Or we'd have to go outside and he'd measure up something outside. Or say that he needed another prototype made. And so this sort of sense that if a genius can't decide or needs time, perhaps a lowly struggling architect needs to take a little bit more time to make a decision and to force a prototype, to force a slowing of the decision making. I remember a seminal moment in one of my projects where a project manager rang me up and he said, I'm just sick of this. I've got to know by tonight what colour that is. And I said to him, well, you can't. I'm not going to tell you. Utzon took 3 years to decide what colour white the shells would be. And I think it was worthwhile waiting. I'm not going to take 3 years. You can have your answer at the end of the week.
And you won.
I did.
So,
And I don't think I got the colour right either.
so Alto, Utzon, Scarpa, Gaudi, you are inspired by all, and for very particular reasons. It strikes me that you know what you get from each of them as you see them.
I've always been interested in architects that see history as a continuum, and that they learn from the past and deeply understand it to adapt the lessons, not to copy it, but to understand fundamentally what is there, and to adapt it to contemporary needs and expressions and cultures. And all of those architects are like that. Hofmann, Saarinen, Asplund, and they're the ones that I really learned so much from.
So this is where we might then bring in Scarpa, and through Scarpa into the idea of tradition.
Yeah.
And I know Scarpa as an architect. I did not know Scarpa as a glassmaker.
Yeah.
Why is this important?
Well, it's a demonstration of how deeply you need to think about something to get the principles from it that you can then reapply, rather than just half understanding something. So Scarpa was from 1937 to 1932, I think it was, to 47. He was the principal designer or principal for Vanini glass in Murano. And during that time, the glass works brought huge innovation back into glassmaking. And the company flourished and produced some absolutely seminal, beautiful works. And a lot of what Scarpa was doing was reinventing, looking back into history. There's a form of glassmaking called mesofiligrano. And this was a 16th century Venetian glass that was fine tubes of different coloured glass that was fused together to create a translucent, beautiful shape and beautiful texture and colour. But then I learnt that, in fact, it was actually Islamic originally, that had come to Venice and been appropriated by Venetians and then appropriated by Scarpa. And Scarpa, it demonstrates a sort of absolute in-depth understanding of material to be truly innovative and inspiring in its use. And you can see that in Scarpa's architecture. This understanding of texture, the understanding of how to work stone or wood, or how to craft a building so that the best of that material and the unique qualities of that material emerge.
And so we've got an evolution, we've got an adoption of tradition and of technique, and it's adapted.
Yeah.
And you also speak of Mirei Shigemori, who's a Japanese landscape architect, seems to do similar things. And then I want to come to why any of this relates to the Issei Shrine, about which you speak beautifully. So from Scarpa to Shigemori.
Shigemori wrote a 35-volume treatise. He was an artist. I'd like to say more about artists in a minute, but he was an artist, wrote 35-volume treatise on the history of Japanese landscape architecture. And at the end of that, he decided he would practice as a landscape architect. And his first work, the Hojo, the abbot's house in Fukuchuji in Kyoto, was his first work. But that was a contemporary interpretation of the historic. And he produced some absolutely unbelievably beautiful work in Japan, but all based on the grounding and the solid knowledge, scholarly knowledge of the traditions, so that he could not emerge them as a continuity and adapt them. So he again was a very inspiring influence. And I've forgotten the next part of your question. Oh, Issei.
The next part of the question is this one.
Issei.
So tell me about Issei and why is it important? Again, what we're seeing is cultural heritage, adapted, rehearsed, reiterated.
And a different perspective on heritage. I mean, for us, heritage is too often focused on the fabric, not the intangible things, not the cultural things. And also we have a very thin understanding of sustainability that doesn't include culture often. It's about physical things, environmental things, which are critical, of course. But culture's even more critical, in my view. So
what does Issei tell us?
Well, it's rebuilt every generation, as you know, from one site to the next. I've seen it 3 times now. I saw it first in 73, and then in the last time I saw it 2013. And in that time, in my lifetime, almost paralleling my age, a young tradesman, a young apprentice at age 20 could then, 20 years later, be the master craftsperson, and 20 years on could be the sensei, could be the professor, the teachers. So in one generation, you've got the knowledge being passed through. I think there's what astonishes me is that the artefact, the physical fabric is not important. It's the traditions, it's the cultural traditions, the crafting, the making, and the ceremonies that go towards the renewing that are important. And when the old shrine is carefully dismounted, that material, and the material to build the new one comes from the forests that surround Issei, the old material then becomes the resource for renewal and repair of all the Shinto shrines in Japan, because this is the mother shrine. This is the nurturing of the culture, the nurturing of and the sustainability of the culture. Just so beautiful. But even so, and I keep learning things about Issei that shocked me that I didn't know them initially. It's not only about the building, it's about the ceremonies leading up to the building, but it's also something like 1,500 ceremonial artefacts that are fabric and textiles and ceramics and glass and silversmith and goldsmith. They're all remade. They're remade by national living treasures every generation. Such a beautiful idea. The other interesting thing is a digression. In Japan, you know, when I met Ashihara, he was a national living treasure, and I was very humble and bowed and so forth and so on. And then he told me that, well, he's not the national living treasure, it's the work that's the national living treasure. And when he was appointed a national living treasure, he was given a yearly stipend to assist in transferring the knowledge on. So this sense that it's not people, it's something more important than an individual.
So we decry the loss of skills and technique in Australia, and I think your argument is that we place great emphasis on the artefact, the physical, but perhaps we don't backfill with the transference of the knowledge from apprentice to master craftsman to sensei is here.
I'd just like to raise something about artists, and I think my father was an artist, and it's a very important influence in my life. But I've had the privilege of working with many artists in Australia, and I think 40 to 50 buildings that I've done have commissioned artwork. This is well before it became a requirement to do that. And I've learned so much from the insight that they bring to a project or to a understanding of a place. And they think about things in a far deeper way than we do as architects, and they often bring fresh ways of looking at things. And it reminds me of the time early Janet Lawrence and I were teamed together to do an installation in the Bond store in Walsh Bay in the early 1900s, 1990s or something, I think. And I knew Janet's work and I hadn't met her before. And we had this marvellous discussion that kept rolling, and so many common interests. And I think we luxuriated in the debate rather than working out what the hell we were going to do. And finally, somebody who was organising the catalogue said, you've got a half a day to work out what image you're going to put on in the catalogue. And of course, we had no idea what we were going to do. So we were working on this big table, and I quickly pulled out my sharp pencil and started drawing this meticulously architectural drawing of the space and what I thought we were talking about. And Janet was over in the other corner, and she came over and she looked at my drawing and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to draw. I'm trying to give an illustration of what we're going to do." And she said, "Well, we're not having that in the catalogue." and so I walked, very insulted. I walked across and watched what she was doing, and she had a piece of charcoal and she was rubbing the charcoal, and then she had a piece of hair, and then there was a piece of wood that was the profile of which was pushed into the paper. And I said, "Well, what are you doing?" And she said, I'm trying to get to a feeling of what we're doing." And that went in the catalogue. So this is an example of how myopic we can be if we don't open our mind to other ways of looking at things.
It's a recurring message in the podcast to socialise broadly. You make a comment that you had a practice of reading the Financial Review every morning, not because you're interested in finance, but because your clients are. And so exposing yourself to things that may not be naturally part of your fit or your narrow orbit, I think is a term you also use. And so and to be challenged as well, you've always taught. And you talk about the inspiration and the challenge and contest that you get from students as well. So you're an active mind that seeks to be curious, and you, at one point, forgive me, I'm now answering it for you, but you have this wonderful statement in the podcast that says, "My God, why didn't I know that?"
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, that happens almost daily. And my dear wife, Maureen, knows so much more about things that, and gives me fresh insight into things. She's a librarian by training, but has a passionate interest and academic qualifications in fine art and literature and history. And so when we go anywhere together or debate or discuss anything, she'll always have a different, whilst we have common interest and focus and values, she'll always bring a fresh insight and an unexpected way of looking at something, which is so wonderful.
Talk about the unexpected. Richard and I are going to do something that I gave him about 4 seconds notice of, because we've been given the wrap-up and we're going to ask a couple of questions, believe it or not. And so in the podcast, Richard is asked for some lessons to pass on to those listening to the podcast. And I thought he might come up with 3 or 4. There are 20. So we're going to do a little bit of a rapid fire thing, picking some of them and asking Richard why they're important. Richard, sketching, noting and recording. Why do we do it?
I think we do it to see something in greater depth. Even now I carry a tape measure with me, the lesson from Rasmussen, and I measure things. And sometimes I need to sketch them as well to record them. But the process, the hand and the mind are connected. It's important to keep working like that.
Observing people in space. You talk about how valuable it is or was to understand how people walk into a gallery.
Well, I think one of the joys of seeing your building opened is seeing how people use it or approach it, and they always do unexpected things and you learn from that. I mean, I had somebody once fall up a staircase. I thought they were going to fall off the staircase because I refused to put a handrail there, but the director rang me and said, we've just carted off somebody to the hospital. And I said, oh my God, they've fallen off the stair. And no, they fell up the stair. And I said, what do you mean they fell up the stair? Because I'd put an exhibit at the end of the staircase, and their focus was at that object, and they had missed the stair altogether. But somebody once said, and it's really interesting, that people move like rivers, like people in crowds. And when you're in a position to observe the way people move in streets and like eddies in rivers, and there's little pockets that are calmer, and then there's a fast track. And how people move and what they look at and how they see, fundamental if you're designing a space, fundamental if you're designing an exhibition that is a linear progression or chronological progression of things. So, yeah, I constantly learn from people, and kids too. I mean, they always do unexpected things.
Nobody knows sandstone like you, I believe. What do you know about sandstone, and what do we need to know?
Well, what I know about sandstone is what the quarry master at Gosford taught me. And then what I guess I've appropriated from that to ask questions of other quarries that I've been to. But it's so marvellous to go to a quarry, and you can go to Piles Creek Quarry in Gosford, and I can see and remember the different stratums of that quarry where our buildings have come from. And it depends what sort of stone you want and how you work the stone. And of course, and how the stone is made geologically. Sandstone sedimentary, and it sort of builds upon layer upon layer upon layer. And of course, it's easy to split that way. And if you split it that way and then turn the stone up that way and put it on a building, you get this horrible veining. Nature didn't intend it to be viewed that way, and it doesn't weather very well. But if you actually cut it and then that way and put that on the building, it looks supremely beautiful, and it weathers perfectly. So it's a matter of knowing how the material was formed, how to best work with it, and which part of the quarry you can get it from, the sort of stone you want, and what's going to happen to it when the weather hits it. And all of those things the quarry master knows. And it's like this connection, important connection for architects with craft people who know, who can teach you so much. That's all.
Thank you. Are there questions? There is a hand there in the first instance and then down here.
Thank you for your insightful conversation. My question is in regard to the future. So what does it take to be an architect not in the present tense, but in the future tense? So could you, I guess, either reflect or speculate on what the role of the architect would be in the future? I mean, one of the takeaway messages I've received this evening is it seems to me that the role of the architect in the future is a custodian of cultural values and traditions. I guess maybe you could reflect on that as well.
I think, yes, that's part of it, but I think it's also... What I absolutely believe is that architecture, to be worthy of the term, I mean, all buildings are not architecture. Architecture requires effort and thought, and it ought to express, whether it's a small building or a large building, whether it's a private building or a public building, if it goes through a process that turns it into architecture, it needs to say something about our time, our culture, our values, so that people looking back on that can interpret the best of our time through that. So looking into the future, it's not only about knowing the knowledge and tapping into and appropriating the deep knowledge that lies behind us, but also understanding our time, understanding the values and the aspirations of this moment, and being able to interpret those with the aid of that past knowledge. And I think there's incredible challenges ahead of us. Right now, enormous challenges, but as we move forward, our buildings are getting very, very complicated. The demands of sustainability, of material use, of energy, these are all critical issues. Our housing shortage. And I think architects and architecture can do a lot for that. But you've got to work at the moment and know that that building that you're building, that you're committing all of these resources and energy and effort in terms of making it, is going to be there for decades and hopefully actually survive many, many generations, because I think the most sustainable building in my mind is the one that's loved, because it's not demolished. It's kept and adapted to future needs and uses. And all the embodied energy and the materials and the energy, the intellectual energy, the craft energy in making it is preserved.
Make buildings that are loved. There is, thank you, do you mind putting up your hand again? The lights aren't quite where I would like them to be, so forgive me, but thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I just wanted to ask how you feel about your legacy, and if you feel satisfied, as I'd assume you would. When did that start happening? Was there a moment, or was there a part of your life where you were like, wow, I've really made it, or this is something?
Aldo Jurgler used to say that you could not be a good architect until you'd turned 50.
Well, look, I'll never be happy because I think whenever you do something, you can always make it better next time.
Thanks.
I think there's always lessons you can learn that the next project will be better because of the knowledge or the way of doing it. I haven't hit my stride.
Your best building is the next one.
Well, that's what I always said, but I'm getting a bit old to keep producing buildings.
But you also, in the podcast, you also talk about how proud, one of your proudest moments is the work in JPW in the number of architects that came through and used it as a training ground.
Well, I'm sure if I could see faces, in this blinding light, I can't see anybody.
But I'm sure there are people in the audience that have worked and alongside me, and I'm so grateful for all of the talent and dedication that went into making all those buildings that we did. I did nothing on my own. It's impossible at the sort of practice scale that I was being involved in that I could do anything singularly, except some of those exhibitions I did on my own. That's why I love them so much. But yes, I mean, there's so many great people that really were generous to work with us, that moved on to their own practices and producing great work. That's probably a greater legacy than anything I've done, I think, individually.
Was there one more question over this side? And then I want to do the other side. Lydia, where are you? Oh, forgive me. I'm going to give my microphone. Behind you.
I've so enjoyed this tonight. Thank you very much. And I hope it's not a downer question, but it's probably one that we all consider. When you're working in a really creative field, how you balance the desire to be creative and inspired with simply being part of a business, and what your reflections would be on that.
I think this is why I've been fortunate to work collaboratively with great people, and you can I guess balance what's ahead of you, what you need to do, with surrounding yourself with really good people. I don't know that I've properly answered the question, but
I was fortunate to work with JPW and watch from a close distance. Richard with Jeff Walker and Adrian Pilton, and from where I sat, you were a lovely group, because there were the three, and it's rather famous in architecture, JPW, BVN, there's a whole lot of, the three letters are sort of what does it. And to some extent, I thought you shared very well. Adrian Pilton bought most of the wine for the practice, that's what I remember.
And it got better as we got older.
But there was a fair amount of, I thought there was deep respect between Richard, Jeff and Adrian, and each to some extent overlapped, but also played a role within the practice.
Yeah, and I think that extended to almost everybody else in the office. And I think one thing that's really important, I think, is to be honest with yourself and know what you actually are good at and what you're not good at, and what you can get other people to do that could do it better than you, that assists in achieving, the common end result of the concept of the building. So I couldn't work on my own. I'm not good enough to work on my own.
You say in the podcast you need reassurance.
Well, not only that, I need talent.
Because there ain't any there. I think we've... maybe one last question and then we will go outside for a drink, actually.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversations this night. My question is about designing process. I'm also studying at UNSW. I'm currently on my postgraduate study. My question is that when I am designing, I'm feeling more and more likely that I'm composing a dissertation or essay when I'm designing and building. For example, finding the problem and to justify why I think one method is the best way to solve that, and then combine them together. It's kind of getting me this feeling. So my question is that normal? Yeah.
There is no correct way or one way to practice. We each have to find a way that that brings the best out of the talent we've got and those around us to produce the right end result. I have a great affinity with your process because in a way, I'm constantly during the design process asking myself questions, not in the rigorous dissertation way that you're suggesting. But one interesting lesson I've learned is that you need to throw away the idea when it's not working. Don't keep persisting with it. The scheme will tell you when it's working. And a lot of students keep hold of the idea because they think it's going to be too difficult to get another idea, and they try and make that idea work. What I've found is that the process of thinking and developing an idea gives you the ability to create another idea. And when you know that that first idea that you've created is not working, you'll know why it's not working. And it's easy to create another one. And keep creating them until it's starting to work. And the scheme then gets to a critical point where it tells you what to do. The scheme is the master. The concept is the master because it embodies everything that's necessary. Back to Utzon's quote, at the point of conception is all that is necessary for its execution. It may take you several iterations to get to that critical point. So keep working the way you're working and if it's not working, throw the idea out and start again.
If you like what you've heard tonight, later in the year, probably around October, the podcast series will be released and you will get twice as much, Richard, as you did tonight, including not 5 or 6 of the points, but all 20 of the lessons. Next in the series, we will meet the incomparable Louise Cox on the 6th of August, and you can get those tickets now. But I do want to ask you to join me in thanking the wonderful Richard Johnson for his generosity.